My own son turned my garage into a criminal operation, and for 4 months, he let me believe I was losing my mind. My name is Patricia Mendoza. I'm 77 years old, and I spent 40 years as a forensic accountant, which means I built a career of finding lies buried in numbers. I raised 2 children in the house my husband Edward and I bought in 1972. I watched my grandchildren take their first steps in that backyard. For 53 years, that home represented everything honest and good we'd built together. And my son Grant used it as a warehouse for stolen goods worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. When Edward passed 3 years ago, I thought the hardest part of my life was behind me. I had my routine morning tea, tending the garden Edward loved, Sunday dinners with family. Grant struggled financially, always had, so when he asked if he could store some boxes in my garage, I said yes, without hesitation. What kind of mother wouldn't help her own child? But Grant made a critical mistake. He assumed that because I'm 77, because my hands shake sometimes when I pour coffee, because I need reading glasses now, that I'd lost the one skill that defined my entire professional life, the ability to spot a con. He told me the security camera was broken. He told me I was imagining the noises at 3 in the morning. His wife Stephanie patted my hand and said it was normal at my age to confuse dreams with reality. They were so careful, so patient with the confused old woman. What they didn't know was that I'd installed a new security system, one that recorded everything directly to the cloud. And when I finally watched those recordings, I saw exactly what my son was doing in the dead of night. This is the story of how I took back my dignity, my home, and taught my son that age doesn't erase wisdom, it sharpens it. If you want to hear how a 77-year-old grandmother brought down a theft ring, stay with me. Hit that subscribe button, because this story is just beginning. It started so innocently that I almost missed it entirely. Last March, Grant showed up on a Thursday afternoon with his pickup truck backed into my driveway. He had maybe 6 or 7 cardboard boxes stacked in the bed, and he was wearing that sheepish smile he'd perfected as a teenager whenever he needed something. "Mom, I hate to ask, but we're doing some renovations at the house," he told me, already unloading the first box. "Stephanie's on this decluttering kick, and we need to store some seasonal decorations until we finish the den. Would you mind if I put these in your garage for a few months?" I remember thinking how nice it was that he'd driven all the way over to ask in person, instead of just texting. That's the thing about being a mother. You want so badly to see the good in your children that sometimes you ignore what's right in front of you. I'd spent 4 decades investigating corporate fraud, finding discrepancies in balance sheets that executives swore were accurate. But when it came to my own son, I saw what I wanted to see. "Of course, honey," I said. "There's plenty of room since your father's workshop equipment went to Christine." Grant smiled wider, kissed my cheek, and started carrying boxers into the garage. I offered to help, but he insisted I stay inside. Said the boxers were heavier than they looked and he didn't want me straining my back. At the time, I thought it was sweet, my son looking out for his elderly mother. I should have known better. The boxes kept coming. Every week or two, Grant would text me that he was stopping by to add a few more things to storage. Sometimes he'd come inside for coffee, ask about my week, show me pictures of my grandsons. Other times, he'd just wave from the driveway, saying he was in a rush but wanted to drop off another box or two. By May, my garage was half full. I mentioned it to Grant once, asked him when the renovations might be done, and he got this tight look around his eyes just for a second before he laughed and said Stephanie kept changing her mind about paint colors. "You know how she is, Mom, perfectionist about everything." Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Tuesday in early June, about 2:30 in the morning. I woke up to the sound of a vehicle in my driveway, that distinctive rumble of Grant's truck engine. I remember lying there in the dark, confused, wondering if something was wrong. Maybe one of the boys was sick and they needed me to watch them. I got out of bed, put on my robe, and walked to the window. My bedroom faces the driveway, and there was just enough moonlight to see Grant's truck backed up to the garage. The garage door was open, and I could see him moving boxers quickly, efficiently, like someone who'd done this many times before. I started toward the stairs, planning to go down and ask what was happening, but something stopped me. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the way he kept looking over his shoulder, even though it was the middle of the night in a quiet neighborhood. Maybe it was 40 years of investigating people who were hiding something. I watched from the window instead. Grant made 4 trips from the truck to the garage, carrying boxes that looked heavy. At one point, another vehicle pulled up, a dark sedan I didn't recognize. A man got out, spoke briefly with Grant, handed him something that looked like an envelope, and drove away. The whole exchange took maybe 90 seconds. Grant closed the garage door, climbed back in his truck, and left. I stood at that window for 10 minutes after he was gone, my heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with my age or my blood pressure medication. Something was very wrong. I knew it the same way I'd known when a client's CFO was embezzling, or when a company's books had been deliberately falsified. The next morning, I called Grant, kept my voice light, casual, the way you do when you don't want someone to know you're testing them. Honey, I thought I heard your truck last night, around 2 or 3. Was everything okay? There was a pause, just a beat too long. Last night? No, Mom, I was home asleep. Must have been someone else's truck. You know how sound carries at night. You're probably right, I said, even though I knew the sound of his truck as well as I knew my own name. I've been sleeping so poorly lately. Maybe I dreamed it. That's probably it, Grant said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. Hey, actually, I've been meaning to tell you. I noticed your security camera isn't working anymore. The one Dad installed over the garage. I took a look at it last time I was there, and I think the wiring's shot. I can take it down for you if you want. Save you the trouble of looking at a broken camera. My throat went dry. That would be helpful, sweetheart. Thank you. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table with my hands wrapped around my coffee mug, staring at nothing. Edward had installed that camera system 5 years ago, and it had worked perfectly until about 2 months earlier, right around the time Grant's boxes started accumulating. The camera hadn't broken. Grant had disabled it. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat in Edward's old recliner, the one I still can't bring myself to get rid of, and thought about every conversation I'd had with Grant over the past 4 months, every casual visit, every text message about stopping by the house, every time he'd insisted I didn't need to come out to the garage while he was there. By sunrise, I'd made a decision. If Grant thought he could manipulate his 77-year-old mother by making her doubt her own senses, he'd severely underestimated who he was dealing with. That Wednesday morning, I drove to Best Buy. The young man at the tech counter couldn't have been more than 25, and I could see him preparing his patient. Speak slowly to the elder lady face as I approached. I asked him about security camera systems specifically, ones that recorded to cloud storage and could be monitored from a smartphone. He perked up immediately when I started asking technical questions about resolution quality, night vision capabilities, and whether the cameras could be concealed. Turns out, spending 40 years analyzing financial records teaches you to ask the right questions, no matter the subject. I bought a system with 3 small cameras, the kind you'd barely notice unless you were looking for them. The young man offered to install them for me, but I told him I'd handle it myself. Some things you need to do alone. That afternoon, while Grant was at work and before he made any more midnight visits, I installed the cameras in my garage, one above the door with a clear view of the entire space, one in the corner facing the boxes Grant had already stored, one aimed at the driveway entrance. I'm not as steady on ladders as I used to be, and it took me nearly 3 hours, but I got them positioned exactly right. Then I downloaded the app on my phone, the same phone Grant probably assumed I could barely operate beyond making calls, and tested the system. Crystal clear footage, even in low light. Everything recorded automatically to the cloud, accessible from anywhere. I spent the next 2 weeks watching and waiting. Grant came by twice during the day, adding more boxes. Both times, he made small talk about the weather and his boys' baseball games. Both times, I smiled and offered him iced tea and acted like everything was perfectly normal. But 3 times during those 2 weeks, my phone buzzed with motion alerts at 2 or 3 in the morning. Each time, I watched the live feed from my bed as Grant's truck pulled into my driveway. Each time, he unloaded boxes and carried them into my garage with that same efficient, practiced movement. And twice more, that dark sedan appeared, and money, I could see it clearly now. Stacks of bills changed hands. On the 4th nighttime visit, I decided to check the recordings from all the previous visits. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, another device Grant probably thought was beyond my capabilities, and went through every single recording, frame by frame. That's when I saw the labels on the boxes. Best Buy, Home Depot, Macy's, Target. These weren't decoration boxes. These were retail boxers, the kind products come in when they're shipped to stores, and in several clips where Grant tilted a box while carrying it, I could make out the contents through the open top: laptops, power tools, jewelry displays. My hands started shaking. And for once, it had nothing to do with age. I kept watching. In one recording from the previous week, Grant had brought someone else, with him a younger man I didn't recognize. They'd had a conversation in my driveway that my camera had captured perfectly. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I watched Grant gesture at my house, then pat his chest and laugh. The other man laughed too, nodding. I backed up the footage and watched it again and again, studying Grant's body language, the way he moved, the casual confidence of someone who believed he was completely safe. Then I opened my laptop's browser and started researching. News reports about retail theft rings in our area, police bulletins about organized shoplifting operations, articles about how criminals often used seemingly innocent locations, storage units, rented garages, even elderly relatives' homes as temporary holding sites for stolen merchandise. Every article I read made my stomach turn tighter. By the time the sun came up, I'd documented everything. I'd created a folder on my laptop with screenshots, timestamps, and video clips organized by date. I'd started a handwritten log, old habits from my auditing days, noting every visit, every vehicle, every person who'd appeared on my property. Grant called me that morning to say he'd be stopping by the following Tuesday to add a few more boxes. Asked if that was okay. Told me he appreciated my patience with their renovations taking so long. I told him, of course, anytime, whatever he needed. After we hung up, I looked at the evidence folder on my laptop. For months of footage, dozens of nighttime visits, hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen merchandise. If my estimates were correct, my son hadn't just lied to me. He hadn't just used my home as a storage facility for criminal activity. He'd deliberately made me doubt my own mind, played on my age, turned me into the confused old woman nobody would believe. They thought I was just a helpless 77-year-old who'd never figure it out. They were about to learn that the worst mistake a criminal can make is underestimating a forensic accountant, even a retired one. The hardest part wasn't gathering evidence. The hardest part was sitting across the kitchen table from my son, pouring him coffee, and pretending I didn't know he was using me. Grant came by that Tuesday afternoon, just like he'd said he would. He brought Stephanie this time, and my grandsons Michael, who's 14, and Danny, who just turned 12. The boys hugged me the way they always did, told me about their summer baseball league, asked if I'd come watch their next game. I said of course I would, wouldn't miss it for the world. Stephanie kissed my cheek and commented on how well I was looking. Said she'd been worried about me living alone in this big house. Asked if I'd given any more thought to those assisted living communities she'd sent me brochures about. She had this concerned tone in her voice, the one that made it sound like she was doing me a favor by suggesting I leave the home Edward and I had built our entire lives in. Puff. I told her I was managing just fine, but I appreciated her concern. Grant unloaded 6 more boxes while the boys showed me videos on their phones. I watched him through the kitchen window, saw the way he glanced around the neighborhood before opening the garage, the practiced speed with which he stacked the boxes in the back corner. When he came inside, he washed his hands at my sink and asked how I'd been sleeping lately. I said better, actually. Those noises I'd been hearing seemed to have stopped. He smiled and said that was great, probably just neighborhood cats or something. Then he paused, got this thoughtful look on his face, and mentioned that Stephanie had been talking to him about my memory. Nothing serious, he assured me, but I'd seemed a little confused lately, forgetting conversations we'd had, mixing up days. I felt my chest tighten, but I kept my face neutral. Asked him what he meant. He brought up the night I'd called him about hearing his truck, reminded me gently that he'd been home asleep, that I'd probably dreamed it. Said Stephanie's mother had gone through the same thing around my age, started having trouble distinguishing dreams from reality, especially late at night. Stephanie nodded along, reached across the table, and patted my hand. Told me it was nothing to be ashamed of, just a normal part of getting older. Said maybe I should talk to my doctor about it at my next appointment. I looked at my daughter-in-law's face, the fake concern, the patronizing gentleness, and realized exactly what they were doing. They weren't just using my garage. They were building a narrative. The confused elderly woman, the unreliable witness. If I ever did figure out what was happening, if I ever went to anyone with suspicions, They'd already laid the groundwork for nobody to believe me. It was brilliant. Really. Cruel, but brilliant. I told them they might be right, maybe I should mention it to Dr. Chen. Said I'd been feeling a bit foggy lately. The relief on Grant's face was visible. He squeezed my shoulder, said that was really mature of me to acknowledge it. Told me there was no shame in aging, that everyone goes through it eventually. After they left, I sat in my living room for a long time, watching through the window as their car disappeared down the street. My hands were shaking again, but this time it was rage, not fear. That night, I went through more of the camera footage. Now that I knew what I was looking for, I found a recording from 2 weeks earlier that I'd missed before. Grant and Stephanie, standing in my driveway at 3 in the morning. They were talking. I could see their mouths moving and, even though the camera didn't pick up audio, I could read enough of their body language to understand. Grant gesturing at my house, Stephanie laughing, shaking her head, both of them looking so comfortable, so confident in their deception. At one point in the footage, Stephanie had mimicked an elderly person's trembling hands, and Grant had laughed so hard he'd bent over. They stood there in my driveway, in front of the house where I'd raised Grant, where Edward and I had celebrated 47 Christmases, and they mocked me. I closed my laptop and sat in the darkness of my bedroom. In 40 years of forensic accounting, I'd seen people steal from their employers, their business partners, their investors. I'd watched executives falsify reports and accountants' cookbooks, and CFOs embezzle millions, but I'd never investigated anyone who'd stolen from their own mother, while simultaneously making her doubt her sanity. The next morning, I called my attorney. James Crawford had handled Edward's estate and helped me with various legal matters over the years. I told him I needed to see him urgently about a sensitive family issue, and I needed absolute confidentiality. He said he could see me that Friday afternoon. I spent the 3 days before the appointment organizing every piece of evidence, every video clip, every timestamp, every photograph of labeled boxers I'd managed to capture. I put it all in chronological order, created a timeline, cross-referenced it with news reports of retail thefts in our area. When I walked into James's office that Friday with my laptop and my handwritten notes, I wasn't going as a confused old woman who might be imagining things. I was going as a forensic accountant presenting a case. And this time, the criminal had made the fatal mistake of being my own son. James Crawford has been practicing law for 35 years, and I've never seen him speechless. But when I finished showing him the video footage on my laptop, he sat back in his leather chair and stared at me for a full 10 seconds without saying a word. Finally, he asked me how long I'd known. I told him about 3 weeks, but I'd suspected for almost a month before that. Told him about the midnight visits, the disabled security camera, the way Grant and Stephanie had started planting seeds about my memory failing. James leaned forward, rewound one of the videos, and watched it again. It was the clearest footage I had, Grant and another man unloading boxers marked with retail logos. The exchange of what was obviously cash, the casual confidence of people who thought they were completely safe. He asked me if I'd told anyone else. I said no. Asked if I'd confronted Grant. I said absolutely not. James nodded slowly, then told me something I already knew, in my gut. This wasn't just my son storing stolen merchandise. Based on the volume, the organized nature of the operation, the multiple people involved, this was part of a larger theft ring. Grant wasn't working alone, and he wasn't working small-time. He picked up his phone and said he needed to make a call. Told me he had a contact in the police department, a detective who specialized in organized retail crime. Asked if I was prepared for where this might lead. I looked at him across that desk and said I'd spent 40 years investigating fraud. I'd never once let personal feelings stop me from reporting what I found. I wasn't about to start now, even if the criminal was my own son. 3 days later, I sat in a conference room at the police station with James, Detective Rick Foster, and 2 other officers whose names I've since forgotten. I walked them through everything, the timeline, the footage, my documentation. I'd brought my laptop, a USB drive with backup files, and my handwritten logs. Detective Foster was maybe 45, with the kind of tired eyes that come from seeing too much human ugliness. He watched the videos without interrupting, took notes on a yellow legal pad, and asked questions that told me he knew exactly what he was looking at. When I finished my presentation, he told me I'd done better investigative work than most of his officers, said the documentation was thorough, the evidence was clear, and I'd potentially helped them crack a case they'd been working on for 8 months. that got my attention. I asked him what he meant. He explained that they'd been investigating a regional theft ring, operating across 3 counties, high-end electronics, power tools, jewelry organized, shoplifting crews, hitting major retailers and moving merchandise quickly through a network of storage locations and fences. They'd made a few arrests of low-level shoplifters, but they couldn't get to the organizers, couldn't find where the merchandise was being stored before it was sold. He pulled out a photo from a file folder and slid it across the table. Asked me if I recognized the man. It was the same man I'd seen on my security footage multiple times, the one who drove the dark sedan, the one who'd handed Grant envelopes of cash. I told him yes, I'd seen him at my house at least 6 times over the past month. Detective Foster sat back and let out a long breath, told me that man's name was Marcus Webb, and he was suspected of being one of the main organizers of the theft ring. Said they'd been trying to catch him with merchandise or making a transaction for months, but he was careful, never stayed in one place long, except he'd been coming to my house regularly, because Grant had convinced him it was safe. The detective asked me if I was willing to let them set up surveillance, told me it might take a few weeks, that I'd have to continue acting normal around Grant, that I'd essentially be working undercover in my own home. I told him I'd been acting normal for 3 weeks already, I could manage a few more. Over the next 10 days, plainclothes officers installed additional cameras around my property, ones even more sophisticated than mine. They briefed me on what to do and what not to do, told me to maintain my routine, keep letting Grant store his boxers, act like the confused old woman he thought I was. The hardest part was the next Sunday dinner. Grant and Stephanie brought the boys over, and we ate pot roast at my dining room table like we'd done 100 times before. My grandsons told me about their summer plans. Stephanie complimented my cooking. Grant asked if I needed any help around the house. I smiled and said no, I was managing fine. Told them the only help I needed was someone to explain how to use the new TV remote Christine had bought. Me made a joke about being too old to learn new technology. Grant laughed, showed me which buttons to press, and said I shouldn't worry about it. Told me lots of people my age had trouble with modern gadgets. After they left, I cleared the dishes with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. I'd served pot roast to my son while police officers watched from an unmarked van down the street. I'd laughed at his jokes while wearing a wire that recorded every word. Detective Foster had asked me that first day in his office if I understood that my testimony could send my own son to prison. I told him I understood. What he didn't understand was that Grant had already made his choice. He chose to use me. He chose to make me doubt my own mind. He chose to turn the house where I raised him into a storage facility for stolen goods. I was just choosing not to let him get away with it. Detective Foster called me on a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks into the surveillance operation. He asked if I could come down to the station, said he had something important to discuss. When I arrived, he took me to the same conference room where we'd first met. This time, he had another person with him, a woman in her early 50s who introduced herself as Assistant District Attorney Linda Marsh. She got straight to the point, told me they'd been reviewing all the footage from my cameras and the police surveillance equipment, said they had enough to arrest Grant and several others, but there was a problem. They could prove Grant was storing stolen merchandise, but they needed to prove he knew it was stolen. They needed evidence of intent, of knowledge, of participation in the larger operation. Without that, Grant's attorney could argue he'd been duped by Marcus Webb, could claim he thought he was storing legitimate merchandise for a friend, could potentially reduce the charges significantly, or even get them dismissed. I asked her what she needed. She said they needed direct evidence that Grant knew exactly what he was doing, communications, financial records, something that proved he wasn't just a storage facility, but an active participant in the theft ring. I sat there thinking about 40 years of forensic investigations, about how criminals always leave paper trails, always make mistakes with money, always document things they shouldn't because they never think they'll get caught. Then I remembered something. 3 months earlier, Grant had asked to use my computer, said his laptop was being repaired and he needed to check his email quickly. I'd let him use the desktop in my study, the same one Edward had used for years, the one I'd kept exactly as he'd left it. Grant had been in there for maybe 20 minutes, I'd brought him coffee, and he'd quickly minimized whatever he'd been looking at on the screen. At the time, I thought nothing of it. But now I wondered, had he logged into something on my computer? Had he left any traces? I told Detective Foster and Ada Marsh about this. Asked if they could examine my computer, see if there was anything there. They brought in a digital forensics specialist that same afternoon, a young woman named Teresa Chen who reminded me of my daughter, Christine, competent, focused, no nonsense. She took my computer into another room, and I sat with James Crawford drinking terrible police station coffee while we waited. 2 hours later, Teresa came back with her laptop and a satisfied expression. She told me Grant had indeed logged into his email account on my computer. And because I'd never cleared my browser history or cache because Edward had set the computer to save passwords for convenience and I'd never changed those settings, everything was still there. She pulled up her laptop and showed me emails between Grant and Marcus Webb going back 7 months, detailed discussions about merchandise, prices, pickup schedules, messages about how much storage space Grant had available, negotiations over his cut of the profits, 15% of gross sales. There were emails between Grant and other members of the theft ring too, people coordinating which stores to hit, what items to prioritize, when to move merchandise out of my garage to secondary locations. And there was one email that made my blood run cold. It was from Grant to Marcus, dated 2 months earlier. Marcus had apparently expressed concern about using Grant's mother's garage, worried that I might catch on. Grant's response was right there in black and white. He'd written that I was 77 and getting confused easily, that he'd already started planting the idea that my memory was failing, that even if I did suspect something, nobody would believe the confused old lady over him. He'd actually written the words, "She's the perfect cover because she's too old to be a credible witness." Ada Marsh read the email twice, then looked at me with something like sympathy in her eyes. She told me she was sorry I had to see that. I told her I wasn't sorry. I was glad, because now there was no ambiguity, no room for excuses, no way for Grant to claim he didn't know what he was doing. Teresa found something else too. Bank statements Grant had accessed through my computer, checking his balance after deposits. Over the past 6 months, he'd deposited over $47,000 in irregular amounts, always under $10,000, to avoid bank reporting requirements. Every deposit came within a few days of a midnight visit to my house. Detective Foster spread the evidence out on the table, the video footage, the emails, the bank records, the surveillance photos of Marcus Webb and other theft ring members at my property. He told me they were ready to move forward, said they'd been watching Marcus's patterns, and based on the email communications, there was going to be another large delivery to my garage in the next few days, Thursday night, probably around 2 or 3 in the morning. He asked if I was prepared for what would happen. Explained that they'd wait until the merchandise was being unloaded, until everyone was on my property with the stolen goods, and then they'd move in. Said I should stay in my bedroom, away from the windows, and let them handle everything. I asked him one question: would this be enough to convict Grant? Ada Marsh looked at the evidence spread across the table, the documentation of months of criminal activity, all of it leading back to my son. She told me that with this much evidence, Grant would be looking at significant prison time. Said if he was smart, he'd take a plea deal. I nodded slowly. Asked when this would happen. Detective Foster checked his phone, then looked back at me. Told me they'd received a message from their undercover source, that the next delivery was scheduled for Thursday at 2:47 in the morning. That gave me exactly 36 hours to prepare myself for the moment when police would arrest my son in my own driveway. 36 hours to come to terms with the fact that I was about to watch my child be put in handcuffs, because of evidence I'd gathered, presented, and helped build into a prosecutable case. I stood up, shook hands with everyone in the room, and told them I'd see them Thursday night. The 36 hours before Thursday night moved both impossibly slowly and terrifyingly fast. I went through my normal routine on Wednesday, watered the garden Edward had planted, made myself lunch, called Christine in Boston and listened to her talk about her job, her life, the grandchildren I actually got to enjoy without lies attached to them. She asked how I was doing, and I told her fine, which wasn't exactly a lie. I was fine. I was also about to participate in a police operation that would tear our family apart. I didn't tell her. There'd be time for that conversation after Thursday. Wednesday afternoon, Grant texted me asking if I'd be home Thursday evening. Said he might need to stop by and drop off a few more boxes. I texted back that I'd be home, like always. Added a smiley face emoji, the kind older people use because we don't know all the complicated rules about which emojis are acceptable. He sent back a thumbs up. I stared at that thumbs up for a long time. My son, casually confirming the time he planned to use my home for criminal activity, probably sitting on his couch watching TV while he typed it, completely confident that his confused old mother would never be a problem. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, thinking about Grant as a little boy, the way he'd run to me when he fell off his bike. The Christmas morning he was 7, and so excited about a toy train set that he cried. His high school graduation, when he'd thanked me in his speech for always believing in him. Where had that boy gone? When had he become someone who could look at his mother and see only an opportunity to exploit? Thursday morning, Detective Foster called, told me plainly that everything was set for that night. Officers would be in position by 2 in the morning. They'd wait until Grant and whoever came with him had unloaded merchandise and money had changed hands. Then they'd move in. He reminded me to stay in my bedroom, away from windows, and not to come outside no matter what I heard. I told him I understood. He paused, then said something I hadn't expected. He told me he had a mother about my age, and he couldn't imagine what I was going through. Said what I was doing took more courage than most people would ever have. I thanked him, but courage wasn't the right word. Courage implies you have a choice, and you pick the harder path. I didn't feel like I had a choice. Grant had made his choices, and they'd led inevitably to this moment. Thursday afternoon passed in a blur. I made dinner I barely touched, watched the sunset from my back porch, called my grandsons Michael and Danny, and asked about their baseball game that weekend. Told them Grandma loved them very much. Michael said he loved me too, and asked if I was okay. Said I sounded weird. I told him I was just tired. Old people get tired easily. He laughed and said I wasn't that old, and my heart broke a little more. At midnight, I was still awake. I put on my robe and slippers and made tea I didn't drink. Sat at my kitchen table in the dark, listening to the house settle around me. The same sounds Edward and I had heard for 53 years. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a car passing on the street. At 1:30 my phone buzzed. A text from Detective Foster saying they were in position. At 2:15, I saw shadows moving in my neighbor's yard across the street. The surveillance team. At 2:37, I heard the sound I'd been dreading. Grant's truck, rumbling into my driveway. I moved to my bedroom window, the same window I'd watched from that first night back in June, when this all started. Stayed back from the curtain, just like Detective Foster had instructed, but positioned where I could see. Grant's truck backed up to the garage. The garage door opened. He had the code. Of course, I'd given it to him years ago for emergencies. This time, there were 3 vehicles. Grant's truck, Marcus Webb's dark sedan, and a white van I hadn't seen before. 4 men total. Grant, Marcus, and 2 others. They worked quickly, efficiently, unloading boxes from the van. Even from my window, I could see the retail logos: Best Buy, Lowe's, Nordstrom. I watched my son, my baby boy who I'd nursed through fevers and helped with homework and cheered for at every school event, carry stolen merchandise into my garage like it was the most natural thing in the world. Marcus handed Grant an envelope. Even from the second floor, I could see it was thick with cash. Grant opened it, flipped through the bills, nodded. They talked for a moment, laughed about something, casual, comfortable, completely confident. That's when the night exploded with lights and sirens. Police vehicles appeared from everywhere at once, the unmarked van across the street, to patrol cars that blocked the driveway, officers emerging from positions I hadn't even known they were holding. I heard shouting, saw Grant's face in the flashing lights, the confusion turning to panic, turning to understanding, watched as he looked toward my house, toward the bedroom window where I stood. For just a second, our eyes met across the distance, and in that second, I saw him realize the truth. His confused old mother had been the one who'd caught him all along. I stayed at the window and watched them put handcuffs on my son. Detective Foster had told me to stay inside, to keep away from the scene, but I couldn't look away. After everything, after months of lies, manipulation, and being made to feel like my own mind was failing, I needed to see this moment. Grant's hands were pulled behind his back. The metallic click of the handcuffs was something I felt more than heard, even from the second floor. Marcus Webb was already on the ground, face down, 3 officers surrounding him. The other 2 men were being cuffed by the van. Then Grant did something I'll never forget. He turned toward my house and screamed my name. Not Mom, my actual name, Patricia. like I was a stranger, not the woman who'd given birth to him 49 years ago. I watched as he struggled against the officers holding him, trying to move toward the house. His mouth was moving, shouting things I couldn't quite make out through the closed window, but I could read his expression clearly enough. Rage, disbelief, betrayal. The irony of that last one wasn't lost on me. An officer, a woman I recognized from the briefing sessions, appeared at my front door. I went downstairs and let her in. She asked if I was okay, if I needed anything. I told her I was fine, which was probably the biggest lie I'd told in this entire ordeal. She explained that they'd need me to come down to the station in a few hours to give a formal statement. Said they'd seized several hundred boxes from my garage. The preliminary estimate was between $200,000 and $300,000 in stolen merchandise. That Grant, Marcus, and the others would be processed and arraigned within 48 hours. I nodded, took in the information the way I used to take in financial data during audits, professionally detached. Then she told me something that made my composure crack. Stephanie was on her way. Someone had called her after the arrest, and she was driving over right now. I asked the officer to please make sure Stephanie didn't come inside my house. Said I couldn't face her. Not yet. The officer squeezed my shoulder and said she understood. 15 minutes later, I heard Stephanie's voice outside. She was screaming at the officers, demanding to know what was happening, insisting this was all a mistake. Then I heard her say something that made my hands clench into fists. She was telling them I was confused, that I had dementia, that I'd clearly misunderstood something innocent and the police had overreacted. She used that same gentle, condescending tone she'd used on me at my kitchen table. Except now she was using it to try to convince police officers that months of video evidence was somehow the product of my failing mind. I walked to my front door and opened it. Stephanie was on my lawn, still in her pajamas, with a coat thrown over them, her face blotchy from crying. When she saw me, she started toward the house, but an officer stepped between us. She called out to me, said we needed to talk, that she could explain everything, told me Grant had been trying to help a friend, that he didn't know the merchandise was stolen, that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. I looked at my daughter-in-law, this woman I'd welcomed into my family 30 years ago, who I'd helped financially more times than I could count, who'd sat at my table just days ago and suggested I was losing my memory, and I didn't say a word. I just stood there in my doorway and looked at her until she stopped talking. In the silence, I finally spoke. Told her I had video evidence of Grant storing stolen goods in my garage for 4 months, that I had emails where he discussed his cut of the profits and described me as too old to be a credible witness, that I had bank records showing the deposits, that I had everything. Her face went white. She started to say something, then stopped. Started again. Told me I couldn't do this to my own son, to my own grandchildren. Asked me to think about Michael and Danny, about how this would destroy their lives. I told her I had thought about my grandsons. That's why I'd already contacted my attorney about setting up educational trusts for them, funds that neither she nor Grant could touch. Money to make sure they'd have opportunities despite their parents' choices. Then I told her I'd also thought about Grant. Thought about the fact that he'd looked at his 77-year-old mother and decided she was useful, for one thing only someone to exploit and manipulate. That he'd systematically worked to make me doubt my own mind, so that if I ever discovered the truth, nobody would believe me. I told her I'd spent 40 years investigating criminals who thought they were clever enough not to get caught. Grant wasn't special. He was just another person who'd made the mistake of underestimating someone he thought was weak. Stephanie's expression shifted then. The fake concern disappeared, replaced by something cold and angry. She told me I was a vindictive old woman who was destroying my own family, said I'd regret this, that Grant would never forgive me, that my grandsons would grow up hating me for what I'd done to their father. I told her that might be true, but at least they'd grow up knowing that actions have consequences, even if the lesson came from watching their father face the results of his choices. Then I closed the door. I stood in my entryway, in the house where I'd raised my children and built my life, and listened to Stephanie's voice fade as the police escorted her away from the property. Through the window, I could see them loading Grant into a police car. He wasn't looking at my house anymore. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched, his hands behind his back. The sun was starting to rise. Thursday night had become Friday morning, and my son was on his way to jail because his mother had refused to be the confused old woman he'd needed her to be. I made myself a cup of tea with hands that were finally steady and waited for Detective Foster to call me down to the station. Grant took a plea deal 3 months later. His attorney expenses probably paid for with money he'd made from stolen merchandise to negotiate for probation and community service. The assistant district attorney laughed in his face. With the video evidence, the emails, the bank records, and the testimony from the other members of the theft ring who'd already flipped on him, Grant was looking at 5 to 7 years if he went to trial. He took 2 years in state prison and permanent felony record. Marcus Webb got 6 years. The others got various sentences. The stolen merchandise was returned to the retailers who could prove ownership. My garage was emptied, cleaned, and returned to being just a garage, though I couldn't look at it the same way anymore. Stephanie filed for divorce 2 months into Grant's sentence. Couldn't handle the shame, she told Christine. Couldn't face the neighbors. The judgmental looks at the grocery store. The whispers at the boys' baseball games. She moved back to Ohio with Michael and Danny before the ink on the divorce papers was dry. I never saw my grandsons again. Stephanie blocked my number, returned my letters unopened, made it clear that I was no longer welcome in their lives. That part hurt more than anything else in this entire ordeal, losing those boys who'd done nothing wrong except have a criminal for a father and a coward for a mother. But I'd prepared for that possibility. The educational trusts I'd set up were ironclad. When Michael and Danny turn 18, they'll each have $100,000 for college or trade school or whatever future they choose. Money their parents can't touch, can't borrow against, can't manipulate them into signing over. Along with the money, my attorney will give them each a letter I've written, explaining everything from my perspective. By then they'll be old enough to decide for themselves who was right and who was wrong. Or maybe they'll decide we were all wrong in our own ways. That's their choice to make. I revised my will the week after Grant's sentencing. He's not in it anymore. Not $1, not one piece of furniture, not even the photo albums from his childhood. Everything goes to Christine, to charities that help elderly people avoid financial exploitation, and to those trusts for my grandsons. My attorney asked me 3 times if I was sure, told me I might regret cutting Grant out completely, that people can change, that prison might rehabilitate him. I told James something I learned in 40 years of forensic accounting: people rarely change their fundamental nature. They might change their methods, might get better at hiding what they do, might learn to say the right things, but the core of who they are, that stays the same. Grant didn't steal from me because he was desperate. His emails proved that. He stole because he felt entitled to it, because he saw an opportunity, and because he genuinely believed his elderly mother was too confused and weak to stop him. That kind of contempt doesn't get rehabilitated in 2 years. 6 months after Grant went to prison, I sold the house. Couldn't stay there anymore. Every room held memories, some beautiful, some now tainted. I'd raised my children in that house, buried my husband from that house, and been betrayed in that house. It was time for someone else's memories to fill those rooms. I moved to Boston, close to Christine and her family. Got a small apartment with a view of the harbor. The kind of place Edward and I always talked about retiring to, but never quite got around to finding. I have dinner with Christine every Sunday. My other grandchildren, her kids, visit often. They're younger than Michael and Danny, still in elementary school, still at the age where grandma is someone exciting to see. I treasure every moment with them. Sometimes Christine asks me if I regret what I did, if I wish I'd handled things differently, maybe confronted Grant privately, given him a chance to return the merchandise and avoid prosecution. I tell her the truth. I don't regret gathering the evidence or going to the police, but I regret that it was necessary. I regret that my son became someone who could look at his mother and see only a mark to be exploited. I regret that my grandsons lost their father to prison. I regret all of it except the one thing people keep expecting me to regret, which is refusing to let him get away with it. This morning, I sat at my new kitchen table, smaller than the old one, suitable for a woman living alone, and drank my tea while watching boats in the harbor. I'm 78 now. My hands still shake sometimes. I still need reading glasses. I still move slower than I used to, still forget words occasionally, still have all the small indignities that come with age, but my mind is sharp. It was sharp when Grant tried to convince me it wasn't, and it's sharp now. That's what he never understood. Physical aging doesn't erase everything you've learned, everything you've survived, everything you've become over 7.5 decades of living. If anything, it adds layers. gives you perspective, teaches you that dignity isn't something someone can take from you, it's something you choose to keep. Edward used to tell me I had an instinct for lies, that it's what made me the best forensic accountant in the firm. He was right. I could always spot the gaps in a story, the numbers that didn't quite add up, the explanations that were just a little too convenient. Grant bet everything on the assumption that age had dulled that instinct. He was wrong. And now, sitting in my Boston apartment with sunlight streaming through the windows and my daughter's family planning to visit this afternoon, I can finally say something I couldn't say for months. I'm at peace, not happy. Exactly. Peace and happiness aren't the same thing when you've lost a son who chose crime over family. But I'm at peace with my decision, at peace with who I am, at peace with the fact that I refuse to be the confused old woman everyone needed me to be. If my story touched you, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments below. And please, subscribe to this channel, because every grandmother has a story, and some of us have stories that need to be told. Stories about resilience, about refusing to be diminished, about the fact that age brings wisdom, not weakness. Grant thought the security camera was broken. He thought his mother was broken too old, too confused, too easy to manipulate. He learned the hardest way possible that you should never underestimate a woman who spent 77 years learning exactly how the world works. And I hope, somewhere in that prison, he's finally learning that lesson.